You were never meant to hear this. The documents you're about to learn of were sealed by federal authorities for over a century, not because they were false, but because they were too true. The kind of truth that reshapes a man, that corrodes illusions like acid on flesh. And if you keep watching, something in you will die tonight. The innocence, the belief that institutions protect us, that good men always prevail. Gone. In the swamplands of South Carolina, where the air hums like it's remembering something foul, a structure once stood that even the birds wouldn't land near. Locals called it Angel's Rest. A chapel, yes, but not one of salvation. It was the epicenter of a legacy soaked in blood, deception, and ritualistic cruelty. It was the killing floor of the Whitworth family, one of America's most respected religious dynasties. At least, that's what the papers said. Between 1789 and 1832, over 2,000 people disappeared after stepping foot in Angel's Rest. But it wasn't just the scale of the horror, it was the precision. The surgical method by which faith was turned into a weapon, salvation into a snare, and theology into torture. These weren't chaotic crimes. These were orchestrated symphonies of psychological domination, built on doctrine, justified by scripture, and veiled in hospitality. What was done there wasn't madness. It was business, a spiritually sanctioned, community-protected enterprise of death. But you're not here for ghosts and legends. You're here for the truth. The kind of truth carved from sealed ledgers, unearthed testimonies, and blood-stained floorboards hidden beneath a preacher's feet. And the truth is this: the Whitworths didn't just murder. They engineered faith into a control system. They weaponized belief. Gabriel Whitworth wasn't a lunatic. He was a tactician, born from a collapsed aristocracy, trained in social optics, steeped in predestined dogma. He built a theology that stripped his victims of hope while cloaking himself in divine authority. His chapel wasn't a church. It was a theater. The congregation, an audience of accomplices, and behind every hymn, every whispered amen, was the machinery of torture grinding underneath. This isn't the history you were taught. Because this isn't history that uplifts, it corrupts, it infects, it reveals. And if you think that was centuries ago, let me ask you something. How do you think systems like this vanish? They don't. They adapt. Keep watching. They called it Angel's Rest, but the ground beneath it was soaked in something far older than blood. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stood in a place so quiet that it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath? That's what it's like at the ruins now. The trees lean in too close, the wind doesn't move right, and the stone foundation that remains, it pulses with a presence that isn't gone. What if I told you Angel's Rest wasn't built on holy land, but on land that had already been claimed, long before Gabriel Whitworth laid the first brick, long before the Christian cross ever touched that soil? This land belonged to something else. There are records not in libraries, not in town halls, but in whispered oral traditions passed down by the Gullah people who lived nearby. They never went near the chapel, not even when promised wages or protection. They said the land was a cracked beneath, a place where the veil between the living and dead was thin as old linen, a place where things get in. Gabriel knew. Oh, he knew. That's why he chose it. You see, evil doesn't start with knives and chains. It starts with permission. Starts with permission. The kind that's whispered in dreams, the kind that makes a man wake up in sweat and build the thing he saw. Gabriel wasn't building a church. He was building a gate. He wrote once, in a letter never meant to be read, "There is an order beyond man's law, and I have found the coordinates in scripture and star. The gate must be opened, not with force, but through ritual. The blood must be deserved. That is the condition." He believed every drop of suffering his family caused was a kind of offering, a tithe to whatever spoke to him beneath the roots of that swamp. And his children, they were born into it, not just taught, formed. If you raise a child inside a church built on a lie and call that lie a truth for long enough, they don't just believe it, they become it. This wasn't just murder, it was sacrament. And now, here's the part they tried to bury. In 1923, when state officials broke the seal on the hidden records found beneath Angel's Rest, they didn't publish them. They classified them. Why? Because they found the same symbol burned into the foundation stone that matched carvings found in 3 other locations, 2 in Virginia, 1 in Eastern Europe, all tied to vanished congregations, all wiped clean from official memory. But the carvings remain. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm saying? This wasn't just one family. This was a network, A secret order operating under the cloak of religion and civility, sacrificing not to a god of light, but to something far older, something that doesn't forget, and we're only just beginning. They called it Angel's Rest, but the ground beneath it was soaked in something far older than blood. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stood in a place so quiet that it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath? That's what it's like at the ruins now. The trees lean in too close. The wind doesn't move right, and the stone foundation that remains? It pulses with a presence that isn't gone. What if I told you Angel's Rest wasn't built on Holy Land, but on land that had already been claimed? Long before Gabriel Whitworth laid the first brick, long before the Christian cross ever touched that soil, this land belonged to something else. There are records, not in libraries, not in town halls, but in whispered oral traditions passed down by the Gullah people who lived nearby. They never went near the chapel, not even when promised wages or protection. They said the land was a cracked beneath, a place where the veil between the living and dead was thin as old linen, a place where things get in. Gabriel knew. Oh, he knew. That's why he chose it. You see, evil doesn't start with knives and chains. It starts with permission, the kind that's whispered in dreams, the kind that makes a man wake up in sweat and build the thing he saw. Gabriel wasn't building a church, he was building a gate. He wrote once, in a letter never meant to be read, "There is an order beyond man's law, and I have found the coordinates in scripture and star. The gate must be opened, not with force, but through ritual. The blood must be deserved. That is the condition." He believed every drop of suffering his family caused was a kind of offering, a tithe to whatever spoke to him beneath the roots of that swamp. And his children, they were born into it. Not just taught, formed. If you raise a child inside a church built on a lie and call that lie a truth long enough, they don't just believe it, they become it. This wasn't just murder, it was sacrament. And now here's the part they tried to bury. In 1923, when state officials broke the seal on the hidden records found beneath Angel's Rest, they didn't publish them, they classified them. Why? Because they found the same symbol burned into the foundation stone that matched carvings found in 3 other locations, 2 in Virginia, 1 in Eastern Europe, all tied to vanished congregations. All wiped clean from official memory, but the carvings remain. Do you see what I'm saying? This wasn't just one family, this was a network, a secret order operating under the cloak of religion and civility, sacrificing not to a god of light, but to something far older. Something that doesn't forget. And we're only just beginning, yet I know what you're thinking. If this is all true, if the ground is tainted, if something sleeps down there, then why hasn't it surfaced? Why haven't we seen the worst? The answer is, you have. You just didn't know where to look. Every 13 years since the fire, something happens in or near the valley, not always dramatic. Not always front page, but always wrong. The kind of stories that don't make sense even when you read them twice. 1985. A park ranger found wandering naked and mute near the burned chapel. Medical notes mention extreme vestibular disorientation, a ritualistic scarring, and a complete loss of short-term memory. His name was scrubbed from all public records. Gone. 1998. An entire wedding party disappeared while hiking near Angel's Rest. 15 people. Clear skies. No signs of struggle. No bodies. The only thing search teams recovered was a disposable camera wedged between 2 rocks, half melted. 1 photo survived. Blurry, overexposed. But you can just make out something behind the trees. Not someone. Something. And then 2011, the sinkhole incident. Official report blames a geothermal instability, but the measurements don't line up. The hole wasn't a collapse, it was pushed open, as if something below had shifted, like the skin of the world bulged, then relaxed. And now we're here again. 13 years later, do the math. So, I found a trail camera set up near the old site, one of those motion-activated ones hunters use. It was crushed, lens melted, memory card snapped in half. But the soil nearby, burned from the inside out. I sent samples to a lab. The technician called me 3 days later and asked if I'd sent her something from a crematorium. I didn't, and here's the part that keeps me up at night. I think someone's trying to wake it up. Because in the last 3 months I've found fresh footprints at the site, offerings, bones, scraps of parchment with more of that same symbol. Someone is feeding it, which means it's hungry. I went back one last time, July 3rd, just after midnight. I shouldn't have. I knew it. The whole way up the trail, my chest felt tight, like something invisible was pulling me backward, gripping my ribs. Every step closer, the air got heavier, not colder, just denser, like breathing through oil. The chapel site was different, not ruined, cleaned, as if someone had swept the stone, removed the ash, reset the boundary stones. There were symbols etched freshly into the rock, not carved, burned in. The air above them shimmered like a mirage. I stood just outside the circle. And then I heard it, a voice, but not out loud, not in my ears. It vibrated inside my chest like a second heartbeat. Too deep to be human, too slow. It didn't speak in words, but I understood it. Not thoughts, impulse, hunger, recognition. Like it knew me, I backed away, stumbling, but the ground felt wrong, spongy, like the top layer wasn't soil anymore, but skin. And then I saw the figure, tall, thin, motionless, watching me from the tree line. No flashlight, no face I could make out, just standing there. And as I turned to run, it didn't chase me, it just smiled. I didn't see it, I felt it. A grin that split something open behind my eyes. I made it back to my car and didn't stop driving until sunrise. Haven't been back since, but last night I got an email from a burner account. No name, no message. Just a subject line, it's almost time, and attached, a photo, taken at night, black trees, glowing symbols, and in the center, standing in the exact place I'd been days earlier, me. But I never took it. I've never worn the clothes I'm wearing in that photo. And there's something behind me, tall. And there's something behind me, tall, thin, smiling. The heavy oak door to the east wing, sealed for nearly 50 years, gave way with a sigh like a dying breath, exhaling dust and rot into the air. No one had entered that part of the estate since the fire that claimed young Thomas Whitworth. Charred remains identified only by a family signet, half melted into his ribs. They said the blaze was an accident, a child's game gone tragically wrong. Tragically wrong. But that didn't explain the scratches on the inside of the windows, the deep gouges in the wood, or the whispers of a "let me out" etched in soot across the glass. Eleanor Whitworth, the family's last surviving matriarch, had forbidden anyone from ever speaking of that night. Servants were dismissed. Journals were burned. The room was locked, bolted and blessed, some say by a drunken priest who vanished into the marsh 2 days later, leaving only his collar and a trail of blood-slick footprints. But secrets are like mold in old houses. They never die, they fester. And the east wing pulsed with a breathless tension, as if the house itself remembered everything. When the door was finally opened by a restoration team decades later, the air was thick, not just with dust, but with a silence so profound it felt hostile. In the center of the charred nursery sat a child's rocking horse, untouched by flame, swaying gently though no wind stirred. The wallpaper, once bright with dancing hairs, was now a canvas of ash-colored handprints. Tiny, some elongated, some clawed. One of the workers, a young man named Callum, laughed nervously and said it must be some kind of art installation. He didn't come to work the next day, or the day after that. When his body was found by the reservoir, his mouth was filled with straw and shards of porcelain. The east wing was resealed. But it was too late. Something had been stirred. Eleanor, now nearly blind and bound to a creaking wheelchair, began to scream in her sleep. Names long dead fell from her cracked lips. Thomas, Margaret, and worst of all, Jonathan. That name hadn't been spoken since the incident in the greenhouse when he was found impaled on his own gardening shears, mouth frozen in a smile too wide for his face. Eleanor began scrawling symbols in chalk on her bedroom floor, symbols not seen since the old Whitworth manuscripts, books bound in skin, hidden beneath the chapel's floorboards during the witch trials. She was heard whispering to someone, or something, that only she could see. "I know what we did," she muttered. "I remember the pact," and the house, always listening, always watching, began to respond. The autumn fog rolled thick across the Whitworth estate, swallowing trees, statues, and scents, urns. It was the kind of fog that clung to skin and left behind the scent of grave dirt and mildew, the kind that dulled the sound of your own footsteps and made you question whether you were still alone. By then, Eleanor had stopped speaking entirely. She sat in her armchair by the window, rocking slowly, eyes glassed over, her hands twitching with some invisible rhythm, as if playing notes on a piano no one else could hear. It was around this time that the journals resurfaced. Hidden behind a false panel in the attic, bound in red leather and sealed with iron clasps, they belonged to Abraham Whitworth, the patriarch from the 1700s whose portrait had been missing from the Great Hall. since the summer lightning storm that split the main oak down the middle. His entries were fevered and erratic, marked with diagrams of arcane geometry, invocations written backward, and long passages about the soul as currency. He spoke of a visitor, the man with no mouth, who came to him in dreams and showed him how to stretch life like taffy, how to chain it to bloodlines and bind it to land. The journal ended abruptly after one final entry. They come not for me, but for what I've hidden. Let them never open the vault beneath the well. No one knew of any vault, but the estate's original stone well, long dried up and overgrown with brambles, had always been odd, lined with symbols eroded by rain, the iron bucket rusted solid, the rope replaced 3 times after fraying without cause. When a team of historians arrived to restore it, they uncovered more than they intended. Beneath the crumbling stone was a trapdoor of blackened oak, sealed with melted wax and marked in a dialect long dead. They broke the seal. The air that escaped wasn't just stale. It screamed. Below they found what looked like a ceremonial chamber, its walls pulsating faintly as if alive. Bones were arranged in intricate patterns, vertebrae woven into spirals, rib cages stacked like totems, and in the center, a mirror. Not glass, but obsidian, and cold enough to burn. Each worker claimed to see something different in its depths. Some saw their dead mothers, others saw themselves as children, and one poor woman collapsed, shrieking, unable to explain what she saw except to say, "It's still hungry." When they brought the mirror to the manor, things accelerated. Eleanor's heart failed that night, or so they thought, but the mortician never arrived. Her body was locked in her room for 3 days, and when the door was finally forced open, the chair was empty, the windows sealed, the chalk symbols freshly drawn. Only now they pulsed with a dim red light. They tried to move the mirror. 4 men, strapping, logical, all of them doubters, academics, skeptics, one even a priest who laughed at the notion of haunted relics and generational curses. But none of them laughed when the mirror refused to reflect them. No image. Just a black surface rippling as if stirred from beneath. One of them, Marcus, the strongest of the lot, touched it with his bare hand, scoffing at the other's hesitation. He never spoke again. He wandered from room to room in silence, dragging his fingertips along the walls until they bled, humming something that didn't resemble a melody, but felt like a memory, half forgotten and wrong. When they tried to restrain him, he whispered one thing before biting off his own tongue. "She's in there now, watching." That night, every mirror in the manor cracked down the center, except the obsidian one. That one pulsed, breathed, and from that point forward, the Whitworth manor began to change. The wallpaper peeled in spirals, not strips. Furniture rearranged itself in subtle but deliberate ways, pointing always toward the grand staircase. Doors opened to places they never had before. One led to a chapel that no one had built, another to a crypt that stretched deeper than the foundations should allow. And at the heart of it all, the mirror stood, unmoved and unmoving, like a watchful eye carved into the skin of the house itself. It had become more than an object. It was now the nucleus. The manor orbited it. The shadows thickened around it, and something within it began to press outward, as if the glass were thinning, like old ice under boot. Then the disappearances began again. First the staff, then guests, then a pair of paranormal investigators who never made it past the foyer. One left a recording device behind. The only thing on the tape, a low animal breathing and the unmistakable sound of Eleanor Whitworth's voice whispering from behind the lens. "You opened the vault. You broke the seal. Now we all belong to the well." The estate was abandoned, officially, anyway. Papers were filed. Ownership dissolved into layers of bureaucracy and silent nods between government men who knew better than to ask questions. But still, lights are seen sometimes in the windows, flickering shadows. A woman in a long mourning dress pacing the east wing, and always the faint hum, like a lullaby sung through teeth. They say the grounds breathe now. It starts at dusk, always at dusk, as if the sun itself fears to witness what rises with the twilight. The grass along the eastern hedge ripples in waves without wind. The trees lean inward, creaking not with age, but as if they're listening, straining to hear something just beneath the soil. The locals don't come near the estate anymore. Not since the night the dogs howled without pause, their cries warping into something too human, too pleading. But there are always fools. One such fool was Avery Locke, a folklorist who believed that every curse was just a story misunderstood, a metaphor stretched too far. She came with her notebooks, her camera, her bright conviction. She lasted 3 nights. 3 nights. On the 4th, she was found standing motionless at the edge of the reflecting pool, her eyes bloodshot and unblinking, her feet rooted to the earth as if they'd grown there. She spoke only once, in a voice not her own. "He drinks from the black well, and now so do I." They took her away, of course. Medics, men in white coats, but she laughed as they dragged her, a thin, dry cackle that echoed for minutes after she was gone. One of the orderlies later swallowed a mirror shard. Another walked into traffic. None of them made it past spring. What is it about the Whitworths? Why this family? Some say it was Eleanor's grief, calcified into hate and flung like a curse into the bones of her children. Others point to the diaries of her husband, Reginald, which speak of as something bound beneath the property long before the manor stood. An altar. An ancient pact scribbled in languages that twist the tongue and leave the reader gasping. And now the manor exists like a wound in the landscape. Not dead, not alive, just open. A scab that refuses to heal. At the center, always, the mirror. Some believe it holds the soul of the Whitworth line, fractured into 1,000 slivers of torment. Others believe it's not a mirror at all, but a doorway. One that should never, ever have been made. But it is there, and it waits. The strangest part is that the house never truly decays. Time rolls over it like fog brushing against the stone, curling through the cracks but never settling in. The walls don't crumble, the beams don't sag. Paint peels, then seems to unpeel, mold blooms only to vanish. Even the ivy recoils after a certain height, as if refusing to cling too tightly to what it cannot understand. The manor resists rot, it refuses to be forgotten, and inside the air is always cold. Not the cold of winter, but something deeper, older. A cold that bites without wind, that feels like breath from a mouth far too large, exhaled from somewhere just behind the walls. Visitors who have stepped inside say that time loses its grip within those rooms. A second stretches. An hour vanishes. One man entered at noon and emerged 2 weeks later with a beard he hadn't grown and eyes that refused to focus. He never spoke again. And the children, always the children. The Whitworth lineage fractured. Yes, but something about the house keeps calling them back. Descendants who thought the family name was long buried receive keys in the mail with no return address. Others have reported dreams, recurring, identical visions of black corridors, flickering chandeliers, and a tall figure with its back turned, whispering in a voice too low to understand. One woman awoke with her hands blistered and raw, nails worn to the quick. She had spent the entire night scratching at her basement wall, trying to dig back down. No one told her about the well, because beneath the manor lies the original foundation, older than the house, older perhaps than the land itself. A circle of stone etched with impossible carvings, a pit at its center that descends far beyond reason. It was covered once, sealed, then unearthed by accident or by the house itself, longing to breathe again. Since then, everything has changed. The walls whisper more, the birds avoid the sky above, and at night, when the moon is brightest, a red light pulses from the floorboards in the west wing, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. It is said that the Whitworths never died. Not really. They simply changed rooms. There's something about the portraits. They watch you. Not in the romantic, metaphorical way people describe haunted paintings. No, these ones follow you with unmistakable intention. Their eyes shift when you're not looking. Their expressions deepen subtly the longer you remain in the room. Smiles curl into smirks. Glares harden. The oil darkens with age, yes, but sometimes the faces don't match earlier photographs. They change, slightly, as though the souls behind the canvas are still figuring out who they want to be. The oldest of them hangs in the Great Hall. Elijah Whitworth, the patriarch whose dealings first brought the family's fortune, and whose name still turns up in the most obscure property ledgers, even centuries after his supposed death. His hands are folded, fingers elongated just slightly too far, knuckles sharp as flint. His mouth is thin, unreadable. But it's the eyes that disturb. They're not Elijah's, according to family records. They're someone else's, or something else's, or something else's. And on certain nights when the manor is utterly silent, those eyes glisten as though moist, newly blinking after long sleep. More than one guest has reported hearing footsteps behind them as they stand before that portrait. Not echoing footsteps, not the old house kind. These are deliberate, slow, near. Yet when they turn, the hallway remains empty, and Elijah seems just a little closer than before. There are theories, of course, that the Whitworths made a pact, old as blood and far older than the churchyard where they rest. that their wealth came not from timber, but from something beneath it, an agreement inked in bone and kept in a ledger not written in any known language. Pages that shift when touched, binding each generation to an obligation too terrible to name. That's why they never leave entirely. Why the house refuses to fall. Why the portraits never fade. Because something is keeping them. And the price of breaking that contract, well, no one has dared try. It was said that Judith Whitworth, the matriarch in the mid-1800s, never blinked. Not once. Not during storms. Not during childbirth. Not even when her husband collapsed at the dinner table, choking on his own tongue after drinking from the goblet she had handed him. Her eyes remained fixed, hollow, watching something only she could see. Some claim she had been born that way, wide-eyed and silent, her mouth moving in sleep, muttering in a language no one in the village recognized. Others believed she had been taught, that she was groomed from infancy for something ancient, something vile. Accursed. Judith's journals, which surfaced briefly in 1936 before disappearing again into a collector's vault, hinted at rites carried out in the cellar beneath the east wing. She wrote of binding the blood to the stone and of keeping the sacrifice close to the roots. She named the names of her children not with affection but with a cold reverence, like she was cataloguing ingredients. Elijah, Thomas, Marian, and one more, the quiet one, never named, never seen in public, always addressed in lowercase. By the time Judith died, if she truly died, no one from the outside had been in the manor for more than a decade. The local priest who attempted a blessing of the grounds went missing the night after his visit. His cassock was found folded neatly on the manor's front steps, soaked in something sticky and black. Not blood, not ink, something else. The surviving Whitworths claimed the priest had never arrived. Years later, neighbors began hearing cries from the manor at night. Not human cries, too stretched, too wet, and never from the same window twice. People whispered that Judith had left behind more than children. That in her final ritual she had poured something into the walls, into the foundation itself, that couldn't be removed, something that still listened, still fed. And when the last known Whitworth heir, Marianne, returned in 1902 after 30 years away, she didn't bring luggage. She brought a single iron-bound book wrapped in what looked like cured leather. Witnesses said she aged 10 years in her first week back at the manor. Her hair went white, her eyes went blind, but she smiled constantly. The house, once decaying, seemed to hold its breath when she stepped inside. Then came the storm. The storm that night didn't arrive like weather usually does. It didn't roll in from the sea or swell from the horizon. It fell, a sudden suffocating blanket of black clouds that seemed to pour straight down from the heavens like ink. There was no thunder, only a low, constant humming, as though the sky itself had begun to chant. The villagers would later describe it as the night the stars vanished, the night the wind forgot to move. Inside the manor, every candle went out at once. No flicker, no breeze, just gone. And still, somewhere in the east wing, someone played the piano, slowly, a single note repeated, over and over again. But there was no piano in the east wing, there never had been. Marian was seen at a window, her pale face pressed against the glass, smiling that impossible smile, her blind eyes locked on something far beyond the veil of rain. And behind her, just for a moment, a shape, not a person, not quite, taller, hollow, stretching from floor to ceiling, moving with the rhythm of the storm. The next morning the storm lifted, the sky returned. But the house looked different, heavier somehow, as if it had fed. Marianne was gone. So was every trace of her presence. No shoes, no garments, no iron-bound book. Just her smile burned, they say, into the inside of the window pane. A curve of scorched glass that could never be washed away. After that night, no Whitworth was seen again. But the house never emptied. Lights flickered on in rooms no one could access. The piano played when no one touched the keys. The scent of iron and old wax drifted from the cellar vents, even though the entrances had long been bricked shut. And every year, on the night of the storm's anniversary, the humming returned. Low, patient, waiting. Local children dared each other to approach the manor gate. Most ran before they got close. The few who crossed the threshold spoke of voices behind their eyes, of warmth on their skin, even in the cold, of whispers promising they'd been chosen. One boy walked straight through the front door and was never seen again. His name was William Everett, age 12. His backpack was found 2 days later, sitting on the front step, zipped shut. Inside it, a small envelope sealed with red wax and addressed to the next. So the question remains, doesn't it? Who or what is next. Then let's descend slowly, deliberately, into the part of the Whitworth estate even the rats seem to avoid. The cellar that no blueprint ever mentioned, that no servant recalled entering, yet every member of the family feared with a dread they never spoke aloud. It wasn't part of the original manor. No, this was older. The stonework was different, rougher, scorched in places, inscribed with symbols that cracked the light when a torch was brought near. The air was heavier down there, thick like water. Breathing it felt like swallowing whispers. At the base of the winding stair, the stone floor gave way to something else, packed earth, blackened and pulsing faintly with heat, and there in the center, a circle carved not with tools, but by claw. 6 figures were etched into the earth. Not saints, not demons, things between. Faces obscured by smears of age, but always watching, always leaning closer the longer you stared. Judith Whitworth came here once a year, always alone. The staff was forbidden to speak of it. And she would descend with a lantern and a single item clutched tight. Sometimes a lock of hair, sometimes a tooth, once a perfectly preserved human ear. She would stay for exactly 13 minutes, not a second longer. She never spoke of what happened in that space of time, only returned trembling and fevered, her mouth bleeding from where she'd bitten her own tongue. One year she didn't come back. The staff heard her scream halfway through the 13th minute. Not a scream of pain, one of ecstasy, of release. When they finally dared go down, all they found was her lantern, still burning in a circle of wet footprints that led away from the ritual ring into the wall. But there was no door there, no passage, just solid stone, until it blinked. No Whitworth has entered that cellar since. But the markings still glow faintly if you speak her name, and if you leave something behind, something that belongs to you, sometimes it's not there in the morning, sometimes the earth accepts your offering, and sometimes it returns something in its place. One villager left his dead wife's wedding ring there, hoping for peace. The next day he received a knock at his door. She was standing there, smiling, eyes missing, mouth sewn shut. She did not move until he said, "I do," and then she never left. You see, the story of the Whitworths isn't a tale of madness or misfortune. It's a transaction, a covenant, a debt passed through bloodlines, sealed in dirt and silence, and the house still waits, the cellar still breathes, and the earth, it remembers everyone who dares disturb it. He was the youngest, Elias Whitworth, barely 16 when he vanished into the moors, barefoot, bloodied, clutching nothing but a small tin box his mother had once hidden beneath the floorboards of the east bedroom. Nobody knew what was in it. Only that Judith had guarded it more fiercely than her own life, and that when Elias took it, the house changed. The walls sweated. The clocks ran backward. Paintings that once showed serene landscapes now depicted scorched fields and skies red with ash. Staff began disappearing. First the cook, then the gardener, then the maid who'd nursed Elias from birth. All gone. Not a trace, no blood, no struggle, just a strange residue on the floors where they'd last stood, like something had melted them into memory. Elias ran, and the house let him. He made it as far as the next village before collapsing, half-starved, fevered, raving about the roots under the house, under the feisted in the whispers in the walls. He spoke of voices that knew his name before he was born. Voices that promised to unmake the world, one Whitworth at a time, in exchange for keeping the darkness at bay. But Elias refused the pact. He refused the inheritance. And that, he said, was why they would come for him, because the bloodline had to obey. He was taken in by a priest who dismissed it all as madness, until Elias opened the tin. Inside, a single withered finger, black as coal, with a ring that pulsed like it was alive. The priest recoiled, then choked, then screamed. Elias never flinched. "It's hers," he said softly. "It's the part of her soul she had to cut off to make the deal. And if I destroy it, the whole thing ends." He didn't get the chance. That night, something came for the priest. It didn't knock. It didn't speak. The chapel walls crumbled inward, like something enormous had breathed against them from the outside. Elias ran again. The village was wiped clean by morning. No bodies, just silence, and a deep, narrow trench cut into the earth that led in a perfect line back to the Whitworth estate. No one has seen Elias since, but rumors persist of a gaunt figure wandering the highlands with eyes that burn in the dark, of a boy who never grew old, of a name cursed not by a god, but by something older, darker, hungrier, and the tin box, still out there, still humming, still waiting for the last Whitworth to return and finish what was started. But if he does, will he end the curse, or will he become its final servant, The Whitworth blood didn't thin, it deepened. With every generation, the line became less human and more something else. Not just haunted by what their ancestors did, but bound to it, reshaped by it, like the roots of the estate had begun knitting themselves into their very DNA. The estate sat silent after Elias vanished. No buyers, no looters, just fog and rot, and the occasional flicker of candlelight seen through shattered windows at impossible hours. But something kept it whole. No matter the weather or the years, the bones of the house stood proud, as if daring time itself to trespass. Then came the twins, Vera and Solomon. Born decades apart from Elias, yet marked by the same strange birthmark, a black crescent curled beneath the left eye. They didn't speak until they were 6, and when they finally did, they spoke the same words at the same time, every time. Doctors called it a psychological anomaly. Others called it a curse, but their nanny, hired in desperation after 6 others fled, swore they once stood at her bed at midnight and whispered in a tongue no one alive should have known. They didn't age normally either. They looked 10 at 15, 18 at 25, always a little off, a little too still, their eyes too sharp, too knowing. They claimed they dreamed in other people's memories, not just ancestors, but strangers long dead, some not even from this part of the world. They drew symbols they couldn't explain, always in groups of 7, always spiraling inward, and always in red. Then they found the second box, buried behind the hearthstone, beneath the oldest part of the house. This one wasn't tin, it was bone. Carved with what looked like teeth, sealed with wax that bled when cracked. Inside, a letter, unsigned, addressed her to the last who remembers. It spoke of a final rite, a way to close the pact and bury the hunger forever. But it required a blood offering, not just any blood, Whitworth blood. The entire line, the twins didn't flinch. They smiled. Not long after, the surrounding countryside began to empty. Pets vanished, then children. Then entire households locked their doors and never answered them again. The estate seemed to grow, not wider, but deeper, stretching unseen roots into places no map ever showed. People whispered of underground halls, lit by no fire, where the Whitworth heirs walked in silence, mapping their family's ancient guilt with blood. Some say Solomon died. Others say he became something, lost in the ritual that followed. Vera remains. She walks the halls now, alone, listening, waiting. Her eyes, they say, are mirrors. If you look too long, you see yourself as you were meant to be, had the house claimed you to. They say at the center of the Whitworth estate lies a door that was never meant to open, not by human hands. Hidden behind collapsing plaster and bricked-over corridors, behind false walls and deliberate misdirection, this door doesn't creak or rust. It breathes. It breathes. Vera found it when she was 17, though no one told her how to look. She simply knew. She'd been dreaming of it since childhood, seeing it in her mind's eye before she could even walk. A smooth black slab set into stone, no knob, no keyhole. Just a single phrase carved into it in a language scholars have failed to place, and Vera never needed translated. We do not bury what still hungers. She didn't open it. Not yet. But from that moment forward, the house changed its tune. The whispers got bolder. Vera. Mirrors stopped reflecting the room they were in. Guests. What few ever crossed the threshold left as different people, speaking slower, blinking less, and smiling only when no one was looking. One even clawed out her own eyes, muttering, "It's inside the walls. It's in the blood." Vera stopped leaving the estate, not out of fear, but reverence. She began cataloguing her ancestors, not by name or date, but by deed. By the weight of sin they added to the family's ledger. Murderers, arsonists, occultists, war profiteers, and those who simply vanished and returned years later less themselves. The door, she said, was not a prison. It was a mirror, a boundary of choice. If opened, it would not unleash a demon, but a revelation, the true face of the Whitworth legacy. And so she prepared, not with spells or symbols, but with flesh and bone. She bred animals with twisted limbs and glassy eyes, preserved stillborn things in jars of salt and vinegar. She collected heirlooms that pulsed with a quiet hum, and dug up graves not to disturb the dead, but to listen to what they had learned underground. And she listened well. One stormy night, lightning struck the east tower. Flames rose, but no fire crew came. No neighbors dared approach. The estate burned, but the next morning, not a single scorch mark could be found. Just the door, slightly ajar, slightly ajar. From that day on, Vera was never seen in daylight again. The estate grew colder, hungrier, heavier. Travelers who wandered too close heard low chanting beneath the soil. Trees leaned away from the house, as if repelled by it. Birds no longer flew overhead. Still, the door waits. Open just enough to suggest invitation or warning. Some say Vera passed through it. Others claim she became the threshold itself, neither living nor dead, but a witness to what lies beyond. Waiting, always waiting. The wind at night did not howl. It screamed like a mother mourning her last child. And through the trees that bent and cracked outside Whitworth Manor, something moved with deliberate malice, its footsteps soft as ash falling through a chimney flue. Inside, the house pulsed with a dread that felt almost sentient, like the walls had begun to remember the sins soaked into their timber. Eleanor Whitworth, the last living descendant, stood in the long gallery surrounded by portraits that refused to age, eyes painted centuries ago, now gleaming as if whetted by something alive. She had returned not out of nostalgia, but compulsion. The diary, her great-grandmother's, had found its way into her possession through a package with no return address, bound in brittle leather that smelled faintly of scorched rosemary and iron. And with every page she read, the truth thickened like a storm cloud pregnant with blood. Her ancestors hadn't just suffered from darkness. They had made pacts with it, nurtured it, fed it offerings not of coin or cattle, but of kin. There was mention of the vault, capitalized in ink, as though it were a proper noun, a living thing. Buried deep beneath the manor's foundations, hidden behind a false wall in the wine cellar, it had once been a place of worship, not to God, not to any angel or saint, but to something older, colder, and ravenous. Eleanor traced her hand along the stone as she descended the spiral stair, the air thickening, warmer now, too warm, like exhaled breath that didn't belong to her. Candles, in-wall sconces sparked to life without touch, obedient to unseen wills. And there it was, the wall. The wall. Perfectly ordinary, except for the faint seam that betrayed its disguise. Her hand trembled as she pressed inward, and the panel gave way with a hiss, the kind a beast makes when disturbed in its slumber. The vault opened before her, not a room, but a chamber, circular, lined with shelves of bone and rusted chains, the air pulsing like a second heartbeat. In the center, an altar, and upon it, a book bound not in leather, but in something that squirmed when she looked too long. A voice rose then, not from the chamber, but from inside her skull. It knew her name. Knew the name she hadn't spoken since childhood, the one only her mother used when warning her to be silent near the west wing. El, just that, El. And with it came images, hideous and beautiful, of her ancestors kneeling, chanting, sacrificing pieces of themselves in return for power, influence, immunity from death, for a time. She should have turned back. She didn't. The book opened. The candlelight dimmed. Something smiled in the dark. The shadows did not return to their corners. They clung to the ceiling and the walls like living mold, curling and twitching as if savoring the air. Eleanor stirred with each slow step toward the altar. The vault was impossibly silent now. Not a drip, not a breath, not even the tremor of her own heartbeat in her ears. Only that smile in the dark. It was not made of lips and teeth. It was a knowing, a presence that had been watching since the first Whitworth had struck the soil with a spade and declared dominion over what should have remained buried. Eleanor reached the altar. The book throbbed faintly, like it contained a pulse not its own, and yet not entirely foreign. She was drawn to it. Her hand hovered, and the air around her stiffened, pressing against her skin like invisible fingers, urging her forward, whispering old names and older truths. When her fingers touched its surface, it did not feel like flesh, nor leather, nor any material known to the waking world. It felt like memory, like grief, like punishment. The pages turned of their own accord. Symbols bled across parchment in shapes her eyes shouldn't understand, but her mind did. The ancestral knowledge, the legacy of ruin, whispered into her bones. The first page bore an incantation. The second, a list of names. All Whitworths, some scratched through violently, others circled in a hand too ancient to name. And the third page showed a family tree. Hers. But it didn't end with her. It split downward, roots growing into blank parchment. And then ink bled up from the page, forming a single new name she had never heard spoken aloud. Aylworth. The word echoed, not just in the vault, but beyond it, into the very walls of the manor. A low-grown timber, resisting pressure from within, sent dust cascading like slow-falling snow. The vault door slammed shut behind her. She didn't flinch. Something inside her had already changed. She read the name again, and this time it answered, not with sound, but with presence. A shape began to form behind the altar, not from shadow, but as if peeling out of reality itself, skeletal yet massive, draped in tendrils that moved without air, eyes that burned like coals quenched in tears. It did not speak. It simply waited, towering and infinite, as if expecting something. Something. Demanding something, Eleanor dropped to her knees. She did not know why, but her blood did. The thing behind the altar did not move, yet every molecule of air seemed to bend toward it, as if gravity itself had forgotten its allegiance to the world and now served only it. Eleanor knelt, paralyzed not by fear, but by something far worse, recognition. This was not a stranger to her bloodline. It was the source, the seed buried deep in the marrow of every Whitworth, born since the first stone was laid in this cursed manner. The name Aelrith throbbed like an incantation inside her skull. The pages of the book, now slick with a warmth that was not ink, whispered new lines into the air. Her mouth moved without consent, syllables spilling forth that cracked the silence into jagged pieces. She spoke of bargains made before time, oaths sealed in black water beneath moonless skies, and a hunger passed down like inheritance. Aelrith moved closer, not with legs, but by shifting space itself, folding the distance like parchment. Its face, if one could call it that, loomed before her. No mouth, no nose, only a crown of branching bone, and those eyes, twin abysses flickering with ancestral fire. It reached out, not with a hand, but with memory. Suddenly, Eleanor saw. She saw Thomas Whitworth, her great-great-grandfather, striking a deal beneath the roots of an ancient dying ash tree. Saw him bury something not meant to be exhumed beneath the first cornerstone of Whitworth Manor. Saw his wife Mary screaming in the nursery as the infant born too early whispered Latin in reverse. She saw the locked rooms, the hidden ledger, the crimson veil in every family portrait. And then she saw herself, not as she was, but as she was becoming. Aelrith offered no words. It didn't need to. The pact had already been renewed the moment her blood touched the page. Eleanor was the final gate, the vessel, the one born under the wrong moon, marked by silence and the endless stare of midnight eyes. The vault began to tremble, stone cracked, roots bled sap that hissed like steam. Somewhere above, the manor groaned as something ancient awakened beneath its foundations. The curse had not merely slept, it had waited. And Eleanor, breath shallow, spine arched back in ecstatic terror, finally understood. This had never been about saving the Whitworth name. It was about unleashing it. The wind howled as the manor exhaled its final breath, a slow, grinding sigh from its deepest stones. The vault collapsed inward, sealing the ancient altar beneath centuries of ruin and soil. In that moment, Whitworth Manor ceased to be a house. It became a tomb not just of stone and bone, but of a legacy too foul to endure daylight. No one saw Eleanor again, not truly. Fui. Some said a woman emerged from the debris barefoot and blood-soaked, her eyes milky with knowledge no human should bear. Others whispered she still walks the surrounding moors at night, humming lullabies in a language older than grief. But no record remains, no grave, no closure. The land was deemed unfit for rebuilding. Surveyors reported strange compass readings, an unbearable chill, and shadows that moved against the sun. Locals crossed themselves when passing too near. Over time, ivy devoured the ruins, and earth swallowed the rest, but the stories never stop. They still tell them, in hushed tones, around fires, late at night. They speak of the Whitworth line, of what was awakened, what was promised, and what was paid. And if you ever find yourself walking the edge of that cursed hillside, tread lightly, for the earth beneath you remembers. It remembers blood, it remembers names, and it remembers you. The Whitworth tale is over, but the debt remains.